So yeah, I'm Ted Blackman. Yeah, I'd also like to thank the Meteor team for having me here. I'm very happy to be here. I've been working with Meteor for the past 6 months, building this site. Shameless plug, it's joinjspot.com. And it's a Jewish dating site. The company's called Makeout Labs. It's me and my co-founder, Alyssa Shavinsky. And we have plans to very soon expand beyond Jewish dating and have a whole take over the world plan, which if any of your investors are here, that would be great. If not, I won't bore you with it. So I was coming from a Django background, and then 6 months ago, I decided to switch to Meteor, and I've been very happy with it. I don't think I've ever had this much fun coding for long periods of time. But here, probably the biggest sort of overall category of things that I've found to be difficult with Meteor have been integrating other JavaScript libraries. So things like other jQuery plugins that modify the DOM. So things like little sliders or date pickers or these little widgets that you really don't want to write yourself. And you generally just have to bring them in. So I'll explain a bit about how to do that and how to get them reactive. I've written a couple packages for it. I'll tell you a little bit about JSpot first. And so here I'll go ahead and log in. And hope this works. So here we are. So here are our users. And this is actually using a jQuery plugin called Isotope. So you can animate it. Yeah, and so you can see that you can filter people. And then without violating too many of our users' privacy, I'll just say this is basically what it looks like. So I'll go into a bit of detail about how I did this, and I'm going to take. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I don't have any Technicolor Spark rainbows for you. I wish I did. That was awesome, but I'm going to have to. And I'm a little shy. I don't usually code in front of other people. So I'll probably just show you a bit of some of the packages I've written to deal with this problem. So the general problem is that with dealing with external libraries with Meteor is that Meteor has reactivity, which was discussed in a little bit by Chris. But this idea that Meteor handles changing the HTML for you. So let's say you have basically a table in your database, or it's a Mongo collection, right? So you run some query on your collection, for JSpot, it's all the users in New York who are active, right? Show those on the screen. And then as that list changes, so as the data in the database changes, you do a little bit of wiring, a couple of functions, and Meteor will change what's on the screen based on the contents of the database. So there's this sort of pretty much one-to-one correspondence, right, between what's in the database and what's on the screen. And this is really nice because it has a lot of the same benefits of functional programming, right? The idea is you have some inputs and you have some outputs, and then all you deal with is you have some functions of the inputs, and then you don't have to worry about anything else sort of bothering you. And this works great as long as you don't have to deal with a slider plugin, which doesn't know about reactivity. And as you saw, Spark Meteor's rendering engine will take these live ranges, these parts of the HTML that are constantly changing, and it'll change it sort of under you. So the way that this problem typically arises is that let's say you've got a slider. So it's a little slider you can drag back and forth to set a value, and jQuery, you have a jQuery plugin that creates the slider, and the way it does it is by running a function on that DOM element. Here, I'll give you something to look at here. Sorry. So this is the one I like. It's called the NoUI Slider, and I like it because there's not too much to it. It's mostly just a thing to drag back and forth on the screen. And you can use a pretty simple API to get the values out. So here's how you create one. Slider.NoUI Slider. So this here is jQuery finding an element on the page, and then it runs this method on it, NoUI Slider, which adds some sort of opaquely stored values, properties to that element, and often even just creates a few new DOM elements on the page, right? So the .slider element might have just been a div or an input, and then when you run this function, jQuery goes and creates this whole thing. There's a div for this bit, there's a div for the whole bar, there's a div for the container, So Spark has no way of knowing about this, right? You call this function, and there's no way to sort of keep this reactive in a trivial sense, because there's sort of undefined behavior, right? It doesn't fit into that very nice one-to-one stuff in your data goes to stuff on the screen. So there are a few different ways of handling it. What I like to try to do is I'd like to try to keep everything reactive. And so Meteor has a number of facilities for doing the opposite, which is easier in some ways. So you can declare a region as constant or preserve, and so you can have the live updating. You can say don't worry about this part of the HTML. Don't try to live update it. Just let it do its thing. But you lose a lot of the beauty of using Meteor when you do that. And so there are a couple of standard hooks to make this work. One is, so what I do for these sliders is you can use what's called the rendered callback. So every template in Meteor has a function that runs after it gets rendered, or after one of its children gets rendered. And it's called the rendered callback. And so what you could do is you could just run this function, this jQuery thing, inside of there. And then what happens is, if your DOM node gets destroyed, right, let's say you go to some other page and you're not showing the slider anymore, then this whole thing gets destroyed. But when you go back to that page, then Spark will create the original container that will hold the slider, and then the rendered callback, once Spark has done its reactive thing, then applies this transformation to it, and will recreate all your sliders on the page. And this generally happens, fast enough that it's not a problem to destroy it and recreate it. So that's. Does anybody have any questions about that? Sure. Okay. So I'll show you in the docs, and then I can show you an example too. So here we are, render. So you can say template. Can you read this? So template.myTemplate.rendered is a function. So this is where you do it. And then trying to think if I have any good code for this, or even bad code for this around. Let me see. I think it would be. All right, I'm going to give this one shot. If I can't find it, I'm going to not do it. But yeah, here we go. Okay. So this is actually from JSpot. So I have a slider for the questions, and every time it renders, I go ahead and call this render slider function, which is defined actually right up here. And sure enough, it calls the NoUI slider. Right. So here you have this, the rendered. So the progression is, DOM node comes onto the page through Spark, and then the Spark knows to call the rendered function. So then this render function runs and transforms it into this multi-element, complicated slider thing. Does that make more sense? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay, so I think I wanted to like cover that sort of briefly. I'd like to talk about a couple packages that I've written to try to make this whole process easier in a number of ways. So the first one that I wrote was called SessionExtras, and it's up on Atmosphere. So how many of you have used Meteorite in Atmosphere? Okay, great. Yeah, so it's up on Atmosphere. For those of you who don't know, it's a package manager. It's being sort of absorbed into Meteor Core at the moment. And I think that's actually in the develop branch. You can start using it. Okay, so the package adds a few things to Meteor's session to try to make a number of things about this easier. So one of the other problems with loading external JavaScript stuff is load order. And this gets kind of hairy. It's really easy to end up with race conditions in a number of ways where you call some code. Like this here, where you deliberately use. So this is using jQuery to get a script, to load a script from some other website. So let's say you wanted to load like jQuery UI or something like that. I use this for Facebook, for loading Facebook's JavaScript SDK. And I was using it for a while for the NoUI Slider too until I made a package. But right, so what you can do is you can set a session variable in the callback to this thing. And this is something that I found to be a generally useful tactic to bringing something outside of Meteor into Meteor's reactivity. Is that so? Normally, when you're dealing with these libraries, you might want to do all kinds of initialization code once the script loads. You might want to change a few disabled buttons on the screen to enabled. Let users know that they can click on a Facebook button now that the Facebook script is loaded, that sort of thing. And I found that really you really don't want to do this with Meteor. What you really want to do is try to limit yourself to just setting some reactive data. And so usually the easiest way to do this so far is with the session variable. So here, set loaded Facebook to true. And that way, that becomes part of your reactive data flow. So then that just becomes part of the state of your application. So now when you have, now you're closer, you're getting back closer to that one-to-one correspondence between knowing what's the data and what's on the screen. So you can, once you have it in the session, then that will trigger anything else that depends on it. Anything else that depends on the session variable, it'll all get run. You don't have to worry about remembering to call those extra 3 functions that you just added when you added those 3 elements, that sort of thing. So this is how I've been doing it, and I noticed that for a lot of things, a lot of these things that you need to change on the page or load have multiple dependencies. It's not enough to just say there's one session variable for has Facebook been loaded. It turns out that you actually have to wait for the user accounts to load, and then you also have to wait for the user to log in certain conditions, and there are a bunch of other things in general that often need to happen as dependencies for doing something in response to an event. And often a lot of these happen at the same time asynchronously, so you don't know which one of them is going to finish first, right? If I load 2 scripts and I need both of those, let's say I was going to display a slider based on Facebook, right? Whether Facebook is loaded, then sometimes the Facebook script might load first, depending on how the tubes are feeling that day. And sometimes the other script might load first. So what I ended up doing is writing a lot of code that would do a deps.auto run and check for both session variables. But then I noticed that I actually had a lot that were depending on 3 or 4 different ones and needed to run it started to get really hairy. So what I did was I wrote this session.whenTrue. So you pass it either one session key or an array of session keys. And And then when all of those become true, it'll run the function that you specified. And you can actually add another argument to the end here, a Boolean argument for whether you want this to repeat. The default is that it doesn't. So it'll wait for this to happen and then trigger a one-off thing. Because usually the primary use case I've found for this is for waiting for these external scripts to load. You generally don't do that over and over again. So does this make sense?
This is sort of a way to avoid the Meteor auto run,
Exactly. Right, yeah, I had a lot of those. And so then I noticed that I was, sort of doing these a lot, and these, session.whenTrue, and then I had a bunch of other auto runs also, right? And I realized that this is just a special case of a pretty common situation that I've found in general with dealing with reactivity, which is that most of the time you're interested in, or Meteor provides all kinds of abstractions for like writing declarative code, right? You declare you have your templates, right? So that like the way your page looks just like HTML, and then the way you feed that is with just a database query that it changes the results for you as they actually change, and then propagates it across all the clients. But it's very much about like what is the current state. So I decided to write this thing for dealing with events. So this is also on Atmosphere. Released it a week or two ago, and I call it Event Horizon. I tried to pick the most most arrogant name for like a 50 lines of code. Yeah. So the idea here is that I noticed that strewn all over my application, I have these things like deps.autorun. If the user is logged in, then like do a thing. And so what that does is what you were saying. It bails. If the user hasn't logged in yet, then it just doesn't do that thing you're talking about. And so what it really is, I realized that what it really is it's waiting for an event. It's waiting for like the state of that whole application to transition in a particular way. You're waiting for it to transition from something to being logged in. And so I think I'm going to actually have to make this top one here a little bit more robust. But the idea here is that instead of having all these deps.autoruns strewn everywhere, what if you had one deps.autorun that would sort of have events that would fire an event, and then anywhere in your application you can just listen to the event and do something when it happens. So Event Horizon is an attempt to do this, and I gave it a few different ways of firing the events reactively. How am I doing on time, by the way? Do you know?
You've got
So here, fire when true will fire this logged in event when this function here returns a true value. And this is using a part of Meteor's reactivity that's currently sort of experimental, and it's called isolate. And I saw it, it was sort of the impetus for me to write this, actually, was seeing this function come out in this Meteor branch, because I thought it was really cool. So deps.isolate, what it does is it creates a dependency on the result of running a function. And basically what it does is it uses this extended version of JSON. The Meteor uses eJSON. And if the result of that running the function was the same as the last time you ran it, then don't do anything. But if it changed, then notify all of the dependencies of this function that the thing changed. So fire when true uses this. I think I have the code somewhere. Yeah. All right, so I added this devs.isolate on top just in case, because it's not in the main branches. So you should be able to use it even if you're on Meteor master. Sorry, this is CoffeeScript, but so here we go. Whoops. All right, so fire when true actually just calls fire when equal. But so fire when equal, what it does is checks if, very similarly to devs.isolate itself. In fact, maybe someone could point out that I might be able to reduce the whole level of nesting of functions here if I thought about it harder. But this worked, so I left it. So here we go. What it does is it runs a function and it auto runs it, right? So that it'll rerun it whenever its dependencies change. So let's say you're looking for, let's say you're using, this here, return meteor.userid not equal to null. Meteor.userid is reactive, so whenever that changes, it'll rerun this function. And then and you can pass in a value to fire when equal. So fire when equal will fire an event when the function that you supply it is equal to the result of running that function is equal to the value that you supply. So let's say you're waiting for the number of logged in users to reach 10 before you start a game, or or 4 if it's some sort of StarCraft clone. So then you might. Then you can check. You can pass it 4 and then a function that will return the number of meteor.loggedinusers.count, something like that. And then it'll fire an event when it's there, when that happens. So the right. So here we are. This one fires the event, and you can add event handlers, and you can add as many as you want, and they'll all run whenever the event throws. And so events are named with a string. So if you go ahead and run this, and then if you run these top 3 here in a Meteor app, and then log in, it will go ahead and say you logged in, and this function will run. It'll print both of those. So I thought this was pretty cool. And then I realized that you can also do this with. It'd probably be useful to have just listen for whenever something changes, and then be able to have an event that tells you that it's changed to the specific thing that you're interested in, or to be able to say what it has changed to. Sorry. So in this case, that's what the fire on change function is for. So this is just the name of the event here. You can name it whatever you want. And then you can listen to it when a session variable changes. And when it changes to something, the function that you pass it in the event handler, so the event handler function here, the this of the event handler will contain a field called result, which will be equal to the result of that function that was run in the auto run. So that value that changed that you're listening for will be available to the function that you run here. And finally, you can fire events manually. If let's say something was difficult and you didn't know how to make a devs.autorun, so you just wanted to fire it, you can do that too. But then part of it also, I realized after writing a bunch of these that often what I was doing is just running these. It would be function. It would define a function that would return, that would just be one line. It would return session.equals key and value. And I realized that I have a billion of these all throughout my code. I didn't actually check, but I thought it was about that. So I realized that it would be cool to just have a function for this. So I went back to the SessionExtras and wrote a few new ones. So session.getter is a function that returns a function that that checks a key. So here I'll go ahead and demo this. I'm gonna make this bigger. All right. So is this defined? Yeah. Okay. So let's say getter equals session.getter. I don't know. Let's call it loaded. So then getter is now a function. So we can do getter, and it returns undefined because it's actually calling session.get loaded when you run the getter. So this is sort of like an obvious little closure to do in some sense, right? Like, and you don't really necessarily want to like make a function for generating any possible function you can think of. But I found that there's this general pattern that I end up using a lot, actually, and I think that this is worth mentioning here. That this pattern that what I end up doing is having a lot of these functions that call reactive functions and then return true or false, depending on the situation. So like a function called logged in, right? Or I have one called really logged in. Well, so I actually have a second subscription that runs on my user to pull down some extra fields outside the profile. And so they're not really logged in for my purposes until that also happens. And then there's also things like, I have this whole sign-up process, right? So like, has the user started the questions in the question flow? Have they invited their friends through Facebook? Have they finished all the questions in the question flow? Like, all these things have like pretty well-defined yes or no answers. So what I'll show you here is like some of the routing that I use. And this is actually using Meteor Router. I keep going back and forth between using Chris Mather's mini pages and Tom Coleman's Meteor Router. But at the moment I'm in the trough or crest, I don't know, with router. So here we have meteor.router.add, and you give it a pattern, which it converts into a regular expression, I think. And then a function to run when the URL goes to that. So if I go to joinjspot.com/conversation/some incomprehensible string, then it'll run this function, right? And one of the cool parts of the router is that you can filter the routes, and this is very important because I don't want everybody seeing like my admin pages, for example. So one way to limit this is the router has these filters. So the actual function call is down here. So you set up some filters, meteor.router.filters here. So I have one called all site filters and one called filters without login. So there's some pages on the site that you should be able to get to without logging in, like the privacy policy. Right, so that's here. Or the contact us page, all this stuff. That could use a little bit of design, I guess. But right, so these things are things that we want everybody to be able to see. And then there are pages like all the users, which you should really have to log in to see. So that's what corresponds to these two different filters here. And the filters, what they do is they actually just run a function before you're allowed to see the template. And so it took me a long time to figure out how to make a site with a sign-up process that will only let the user see certain pages depending on what the state of their user is, right? And then if they go to one of the pages that they're not allowed to go to, it'll redirect them back to some page they are allowed to see. And this is actually, it's important to note that this is separate from controlling the data that gets sent down, right? Like you have to do that too. And so, Tom Coleman's, I think, security, and he's not here to defend himself, but his perspective on the security for the routing, which I actually agree with, is that it doesn't really matter if somebody can figure out which template you're using for your admin page and make that show up on the screen if they don't actually have any of the extra data that they would need, or like any of the extra permissions that they would need to do something. This may or may not be true depending on your application, but I think for the vast majority of applications it is true. So what you can do is just redirect them off of that page, and that should be sort of enough. So the way I do this is with these filters, and these actually get run sort of in order on most of the logged in pages. And you notice there's like a fair amount of repetitive stuff here, like redirect if, not, started questions, intro. And that's actually this function up here called redirect if, which you give it a function to run and a place to go if that function returns true. Right, so then it redirects it. So you can hopefully, the idea was that I was sick of sort of looking at all these complicated if statements, and I wanted to look at something that I could sort of read. So here I can sort of read like redirect if not started questions, right? Redirect if, if is mobile to the mobile page down here. And then for a lot of these, I end up doing things like, here, if not session dot equals accounts loaded true, and I won't go through all of them, but there are a bunch of them, and then I also use this not function here. So I guess I'm trying to illustrate here that there's this whole like big segment of my application that's all just about these functions that take reactive data sources that they call as they're running, and then return true or false, and then that's how like a lot of the program flow gets determined. And so I wrote a couple of functions for composing these. And I think I should probably make these like underscore mixins really, so that they don't just have them like polluting global namespace. But so here's and, which creates a new function that composes a bunch of other functions. So if you have a bunch of functions that return true or false, and of two of those, we'll call the first one, and if the first one returns false, then it gives up and returns false. If the first one returns true, then it knows it has to check the second one, and so it does check the second one, and if they're both true, then it ands them together and returns true. Otherwise, it returns false because only one of them is true, the other one's not true. And what's important here for the routing is that it's lazily evaluated. So, if for and, if the first one's not true, then it doesn't try to run the next ones. It gives up. And similarly for or, it actually has F1 and F2 in there, but it can take an arbitrary number of arguments. I just forgot to delete these. Okay. So you see that these show up in the router here. Redirect if not started questions. I found that this was also part of that. This sort of idea was important in the events too. So part of the SessionExtras, I have a truth tester. So actually, here I think I have an example. Yeah. So the session.getter changed me, right? So like this will actually, sorry, that's not based on truth. But here we go, to up here, session.truthTester. All right, sorry, it took me a second to find it. So session.truthTester loaded Facebook is a function that will return true if session.get loaded Facebook is true, and will return false whenever session.get loaded Facebook is false. And so let's say I wanted to have an event fire when like accounts have loaded and when session.truth, and when like Facebook has loaded, and when like 4 other things happen. Then I can actually just do like, you know, or of this session.truth tester and some other session.truth tester, and those, and create these sort of arbitrarily complex like logic for when these things should happen. I found that like I feel like, you know, saying all this here makes me feel like I'm just, you know, creating these like what was the term, like an architecture astronaut. But this is a term that I've heard for I think it was Joel Spolsky came up with it initially, for somebody who's just really into building all kinds of structure that's unneeded. But I actually like, I found that like building like bigger Meteor apps, like it's useful to have this sort of framework for like sort of wrapping your head around all the things you're doing. Like as Chris was saying, like if you only have one register to think about things, like if the register is like, did this thing return true or false? If that's the case, you know, have the program behave accordingly. All right, thank you.